Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog clung to Baker Street like a shroud, its yellow tendrils weaving between the gas lamps and muffling the familiar sounds of London's awakening. From our sitting-room window at 221B, I could barely discern the outline of the buildings across the way, so thick was the murky veil that had descended upon the city during the night. My friend Sherlock Holmes stood silhouetted against the grey morning light, his lean figure motionless, save for the occasional tap of his long fingers against the window frame. He had been thus positioned for the better part of an hour, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the swirling mist below. "You have the look of a man expecting company, Holmes," I observed, settling into my chair with the morning paper and a cup of Mrs. Hudson's excellent coffee. "Expecting is perhaps too strong a word, Watson," he replied without turning from his vigil. "Rather, I am anticipating the inevitable. When the fog lifts sufficiently to reveal the approach of authority in distress, we shall find ourselves once again summoned to untangle what lesser minds have deemed impossible." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "And unless I am much mistaken, that moment approaches now." I joined him at the window, peering through the gloom. A hansom cab had indeed materialized from the mist, drawing to a halt before our door. Two figures emerged with evident urgency, their forms barely distinguishable through the fog, but their haste unmistakable. "Inspector Lestrade, by his gait," Holmes murmured, "and with him a gentleman of considerable standing, if the cut of his coat and the authority of his bearing are any indication. Note how he pauses before our door, Watson, not from uncertainty, but from the reluctance of one unaccustomed to seeking aid from others. The slight tremor in his left hand suggests recent shock, while the mud upon his boot speaks of hurried travel from the direction of Belgravia." Before I could marvel once again at my friend's remarkable powers of observation, the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's voice echoed up the stairs, followed by the measured tread of official boots and the lighter step of a gentleman unused to such urgent business. "Mr. Holmes," announced our landlady, appearing in the doorway, with barely concealed excitement, "Inspector Lestrade to see you, and with him Sir Reginald Ashworth." Lestrade entered first, his sharp features bearing that particular expression of frustrated bewilderment I had come to associate with his most perplexing cases. Behind him came a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 50 years, tall and well-dressed, with iron-grey hair and the bearing of one accustomed to command. Yet his usually composed features showed unmistakable signs of distress, and his pale blue eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of recent horror. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began without preamble, "I've brought you a case that has Scotland Yard completely baffled. Sir Reginald has lost his daughter under circumstances that defy all rational explanation." Holmes gestured toward the chairs before the fireplace, his manner assuming that grave courtesy which marked his treatment of those in genuine distress. "Please, Sir Reginald, be seated and tell us what has brought you to our door on this dismal morning." Sir Reginald settled heavily into the offered chair, his hands clasped tightly before him. "Mr. Holmes, I am not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural nonsense. I have served Her Majesty's government for 30 years and pride myself on practical thinking. But what has occurred in my house defies every principle of logic and reason I hold dear." "Pray begin at the beginning," Holmes instructed, taking his own seat and fixing his penetrating gaze upon our visitor. "Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." "3 days ago," Sir Reginald began, his voice steady despite the obvious strain, "my daughter, Lady Catherine, was found dead in her dressing-room. The door was bolted from within, the windows were secured, and there was no other means of entry or exit. She was discovered seated before her mirror, slumped forward as if she had simply fallen asleep while arranging her hair. The cause of death? I inquired. My medical training immediately engaged. That, Dr. Watson, is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire affair. The physician who examined her, Dr. Pembroke of Harley Street, could find no cause whatsoever. No marks of violence, no signs of poison, no indication of any ailment. Her heart was sound, her lungs clear. It was as if life had simply departed from her body without reason or warning. Holmes had taken out his notebook and was making those small, precise notations I had learned to recognize as significant. "You mentioned a mirror, Sir Reginald. Was there anything unusual about this particular glass?" Sir Reginald's face darkened. "Indeed there was, Mr. Holmes. The mirror was new to the household, having been delivered only the day before Catherine's death. It arrived with a note claiming to be from an admirer who wished Catherine to see herself as others see her. The mirror itself was quite remarkable, an antique Venetian piece with an ornate silver frame and glass of unusual clarity." "And the circumstances of its delivery?" Holmes pressed. "A common carrier brought it," Lestrade interjected, consulting his own notes. "Paid for in cash by someone who gave no name. The shop that supposedly sent it claims no knowledge of the order." "Most intriguing," Holmes murmured. "And when Lady Catherine was found, was there anything unusual about the mirror itself?" Sir Reginald exchanged a meaningful glance with the inspector. "This is where the matter becomes truly bizarre, Mr. Holmes. The surface of the mirror was covered with a peculiar film, almost like breath upon glass, yet far more persistent. When we attempted to clean it, the substance seemed to resist our efforts, leaving strange patterns and streaks. There was also a smell," Lestrade added reluctantly. "Faint, but distinctive. Something chemical, though I cannot place it precisely." Holmes rose abruptly and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned again, his eyes held that particular gleam I had learned to associate with cases that truly engaged his interest. "Sir Reginald, I shall require immediate access to your daughter's room, exactly as it was found. Furthermore, I must have a complete list of all persons who had access to your household in the days preceding this tragedy, including servants, tradesmen, and social callers." "Of course, Mr. Holmes, whatever you require. My carriage waits below." "Excellent." Holmes reached for his coat and hat with characteristic energy. "Watson, your medical bag, if you please. Lestrade, your presence will be invaluable." As we prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking upon one of the most singular cases of our partnership. A young woman dead without apparent cause, a room sealed from within, and a mirror that seemed to hold secrets as dark as the November mist that surrounded us. The very impossibility of the circumstances appeared to energize Holmes, and I found myself once again marveling at his appetite for the seemingly insoluble mysteries that others deemed beyond human comprehension. The fog began to thin as we made our way toward Belgravia, but I sensed that the mystery awaiting us at Sir Reginald's residence would prove far more impenetrable than any London pea-souper. In the distance, Big Ben chimed the hour, its deep tones seeming to echo with an ominous finality that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. The Ashworth residence stood like a testament to Victorian prosperity, its imposing Georgian facade rising through the thinning fog with an air of wounded dignity. As our carriage drew to a halt before the wrought-iron gates, I observed how the morning light seemed to cast peculiar shadows across the upper windows, lending the entire structure an atmosphere of barely contained grief. Sir Reginald led us through halls lined with portraits of distinguished ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with silent reproach. The very air within the house felt heavy, charged with that particular quality that settles upon a household touched by sudden and inexplicable death. Servants moved about their duties with hushed efficiency, their faces bearing the drawn expressions of those who had witnessed something beyond their understanding. We climbed the carpeted staircase to the second floor, where Sir Reginald paused before a door of polished mahogany. "The room has remained exactly as we found it," he assured us, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave strict instructions that nothing was to be disturbed until proper investigation could be conducted." Holmes examined the door frame with immediate interest, noting the fresh splinters that radiated from the forced lock like the petals of some destructive flower. The brass bolt hung useless from torn screws, testament to the violence required to gain entry. "Forced after the event," he murmured, producing his magnifying glass to study the wood grain more closely. Lestrade produced the key, explaining that the damage had been necessary when Lady Catherine failed to respond to repeated calls. As the door swung open, we were greeted by a ladies' dressing room of exceptional elegance, furnished with cream-coloured wallpaper adorned with delicate rose patterns. Sunlight streamed through tall windows draped in ivory silk, yet the scene possessed that profound sense of wrongness that seems to emanate from places where death has struck without warning. Holmes stepped across the threshold with the measured precision of a man entering a cathedral, his keen eyes immediately drawn to the object that dominated the far wall. The Venetian mirror stood upon an ornate dressing table, its silver frame catching the morning light and throwing it back in complex patterns that seemed almost to move of their own accord. The glass itself appeared normal at first glance, yet there was something in its depths that made one reluctant to meet one's own reflected gaze. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Holmes observed, approaching the mirror with evident fascination. "Note the intricate scrollwork, Watson, the quality of the silver inlay. This is no common-looking glass, but a piece of considerable antiquity and value." I joined him before the mirror, immediately struck by the unusual clarity of the glass. My own reflection appeared with startling sharpness, every detail rendered with almost uncomfortable precision. Yet beneath this clarity lay something else, a subtle distortion that seemed to shift as one watched. A peculiar film covered portions of the surface, not uniformly, but in swirling patterns as if ghostly fingers had traced mysterious symbols across the glass. Holmes withdrew his magnifying glass and began a minute examination of the mirror's surface, his breathing shallow to avoid disturbing any residual traces. "Sir Reginald, you mentioned this film when Lady Catherine was discovered. Can you describe its exact appearance at that time?" "It was most peculiar, Mr. Holmes, like condensation on a winter window, yet far more persistent. The pattern seemed almost like a map of some unknown territory, with borders that shifted when viewed from different angles." "Fascinating." Holmes moved his glass slowly across the mirror's surface, pausing occasionally to make notes. With surgical precision, he scraped minute samples into small vials, sealing each carefully. He then examined the ornate frame itself, running his fingers along the intricate silverwork until he paused at several points near the base. "Watson, observe these tiny perforations in the frame, barely visible to the naked eye, yet deliberately placed." He produced a thin probe from his pocket, testing each minute opening with delicate care. While Holmes continued his examination, I investigated the chair where Lady Catherine had been found. The elegant piece, upholstered in pale blue silk, showed no signs of struggle or distress. Everything suggested she had simply ceased to live while engaged in her normal routine. "Sir Reginald," Holmes called without turning from his work, "was Lady Catherine in the habit of securing her door so thoroughly?" "Never, Mr. Holmes. She was quite modern in her outlook and untroubled by fears, The fact that she had bolted the door was itself most unusual. Sir Reginald moved closer, his face pale with remembered anguish. "There is something else, Mr. Holmes. On the morning Catherine was found, her lady's maid reported hearing her speaking with someone in this room. Yet when we forced entry, Catherine was quite alone." Holmes straightened abruptly, his grey eyes alight with that particular intensity that marked the moment when scattered facts began arranging themselves into meaningful patterns. The impossible had just become slightly more possible, and I could see the wheels of his extraordinary mind beginning to turn with renewed purpose. The revelation that Lady Catherine had been heard conversing with an unseen companion transformed the atmosphere in the room as surely as if a cold wind had swept through the elegant chamber. Holmes remained motionless for several heartbeats, his keen mind clearly processing this extraordinary information with the methodical precision that marked all his investigations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular intensity I had learned to associate with cases that truly engaged his formidable intellect. "This changes everything," he murmured, his grey eyes taking on that familiar gleam of intellectual hunger. "Sir Reginald, I must speak with this maid immediately. Every detail of what she heard may prove crucial to understanding what transpired in this room." Sir Reginald immediately rang for the servant, and within moments there entered a woman of perhaps 30 years, neatly dressed in the black uniform of a lady's maid. Her composed bearing could not entirely mask the grief that shadowed her features, and her eyes showed the telltale redness of recent weeping. She curtsied with quiet dignity before introducing herself as Mary Hartwell. Holmes gestured toward a chair with uncharacteristic gentleness, his manner softening as it always did when dealing with those genuinely afflicted by tragedy. "Miss Hartwell, you have served Lady Catherine faithfully, and now you may serve her memory by helping us understand what occurred on that terrible morning. Tell us precisely what you heard, omitting no detail, however trivial it may seem." Mary Hartwell clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "I brought Lady Catherine's morning chocolate at 9:30, as was my custom. When I knocked, she did not answer immediately, but I could hear her voice quite clearly through the door. She was speaking in a conversational tone, not distressed or alarmed, but as if she were chatting with a caller." "Could you distinguish her words?" Holmes inquired, leaning forward with intense interest. "Some of them, sir. I heard her say, 'How extraordinary you look,' and then, after a pause, 'I had not expected you so soon.'" There was another silence, longer this time, before she spoke again. "You flatter me," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Then nothing more. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me, his expression grave. "And the other voice, Miss Hartwell? The person to whom she was speaking?" "That is what troubles me most, sir. I heard no other voice at all. Yet Lady Catherine was clearly responding to someone. It was as if she were having a conversation with someone who spoke in whispers too soft for me to detect. Or perhaps—" She hesitated, glancing nervously toward the mirror. "Please continue," Holmes encouraged. "Perhaps someone who was not speaking aloud at all, sir. It sounds foolish, I know, but it was as if she were responding to thoughts rather than words." Holmes rose abruptly and moved to the mirror, his attention now focused with laser-like intensity on the ornate Venetian glass. He withdrew a silk handkerchief from his pocket and held it near the base of the mirror's frame, watching as the delicate fabric stirred almost imperceptibly. "Watson, observe this carefully," he called, producing his magnifying glass to examine the intricate silverwork more closely. "Note these minute perforations in the frame, positioned at precisely the height where a seated person's breath would naturally fall. I joined him, immediately seeing what his trained eye had detected. The tiny holes were so small as to be nearly invisible, yet they formed a deliberate pattern around the mirror's base. Holmes withdrew a thin probe from his waistcoat and tested each opening with surgical precision. "Fascinating," he murmured, then began examining the dressing table itself with renewed interest. His long fingers traced the walnut construction, testing joints and measuring dimensions with the small ruler he always carried. After several minutes of careful investigation, he paused at the table's central section. "The proportions are incorrect, Watson. This central portion is several inches deeper than necessary to support the mirror." With practiced skill, he produced a thin blade and began probing the edges of the mirror's mounting. There came a soft click, and a section of the table's back panel swung inward to reveal a narrow compartment lined with dark velvet. The hidden space contained a single item that made us all draw back in surprise. A small glass vial lay nestled in the velvet, its contents a pale, opalescent liquid that seemed to shift and shimmer in the morning light. Holmes lifted it with infinite care, holding it up to examine the mysterious substance through his magnifying glass. "Most illuminating," he observed, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "A volatile compound of some sophistication, yet one that shows no signs of natural evaporation despite the imperfect seal." He carefully transferred the vial to one of his specimen containers, sealing it with practiced efficiency. Lestrade, who had been watching these proceedings with growing amazement, finally found his voice. "Good Lord, Holmes, what does this mean?" Holmes straightened, his expression now grave with the weight of revelation. "It means, Inspector, that we are dealing not with supernatural occurrence or natural death, but with murder of the most calculated and ingenious variety. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create the illusion of an impossible crime, but they have left traces that the trained eye can detect." The implications of this discovery settled upon the room like a shroud, transforming what had seemed an inexplicable tragedy into something far more sinister and deliberate. The transformation in Sir Reginald's countenance was immediate and profound. The grief that had shadowed his features since our arrival now gave way to something far more terrible, a cold fury that seemed to age him before our very eyes. His hands clenched into fists as the full implications of Holmes's revelation settled upon him like a physical weight. "Murder," he whispered, the words seeming to catch in his throat. "Someone deliberately took my Catherine's life, and with such calculated cruelty." His voice grew stronger, edged with steel. "Mr. Holmes, I place myself entirely at your disposal. Whatever resources you require, whatever influence I can bring to bear, it is yours. This monster must be brought to justice." Holmes acknowledged Sir Reginald's pledge with a grave nod, then immediately returned his attention to the sinister mirror. With methodical precision, he began examining the intricate mechanism hidden within the dressing table. His long fingers traced the network of hair-thin glass tubes that led from the concealed cylinder to the perforations in the mirror's frame. "Observe the elegant simplicity of the design, Watson," he murmured, his voice carrying that particular tone of professional admiration he reserved for criminal ingenuity of the highest order. A spring-loaded system, regulated by this governor here, designed to release a measured quantity of the volatile compound. The silver frame itself serves as a conductor of heat, whether from gas lighting, sunlight, or even the warmth of human proximity, facilitating the vaporization process. I leaned closer, studying the diabolic contraption with both fascination and revulsion. The positioning of these apertures is crucial, is it not? They are placed precisely where a seated person's face would be when examining their reflection. Precisely, Watson. The victim would unknowingly position herself in the optimal location for exposure. The compound, once vaporized, would form a localized cloud of sufficient concentration to prove fatal, yet would dissipate rapidly enough to leave no trace for subsequent examination. Lestrade, who had been following our technical discussion with evident bewilderment, finally interjected, "All very clever, Holmes, but who could devise such an elaborate scheme? This isn't the work of a common criminal." Holmes straightened, his grey eyes taking on that familiar gleam of intellectual pursuit. "Indeed, Inspector, we are dealing with someone possessing both scientific knowledge and a theatrical temperament. The very complexity of the method suggests a mind that delights in puzzles and dramatic gestures." Sir Reginald, who had been listening with growing intensity, suddenly spoke. "There was a gentleman who paid particular attention to Catherine in recent months. Mr. Alastair Finch, a chemist by profession. He was quite persistent in his courtship, but Catherine found his attentions unwelcome and eventually dismissed him rather firmly. He took the rejection quite badly, I recall." "A chemist," Lestrade repeated, his eyes lighting up with the satisfaction of a man who sees a clear path forward. "There's our man, Holmes. Rejected suitor with the knowledge to concoct such a poison. The case writes itself." Holmes, however, raised a cautionary hand, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Patience, Inspector. While Mr. Finch certainly warrants investigation, we must not allow ourselves to be seduced by solutions that present themselves too readily. In my experience, the most obvious suspect is often precisely that, obvious, and therefore potentially misleading." Mary Hartwell, who had remained quietly attentive throughout our technical discussion, now cleared her throat hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but there is something else about the day the mirror arrived. Mr. Penrith, the portrait painter, called that very afternoon. He seemed to know about the mirror's delivery and asked specifically whether it had pleased Lady Catherine. At the time, I thought it merely polite inquiry, but now—" "Most illuminating, Miss Hartwell," Holmes observed, making a note in his pocketbook. "Mr. Penrith's foreknowledge of the mirror's arrival adds another dimension to our investigation. Sir Reginald, I shall require detailed information about all of Lady Catherine's recent acquaintances, particularly any who might have possessed both the scientific knowledge and the opportunity to orchestrate this elaborate crime." Holmes moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose I had come to associate with moments of intense concentration. When he turned back to face us, his expression was grave with the weight of the task ahead. "We are dealing with a criminal of unusual sophistication, one who has gone to extraordinary lengths to create the illusion of an impossible crime. The very elaborateness of the method suggests someone who wished not merely to kill, but to confound and mystify. This is a mind that takes pleasure in intellectual superiority, in demonstrating cleverness that surpasses ordinary comprehension." The implications of Holmes's analysis settled upon the room like a shroud. We were not merely hunting a murderer, but pursuing someone who had transformed the act of killing into a perverse form of artistic expression, using Lady Catherine as both victim and unwitting participant in a deadly performance that had cost her life. The weight of Holmes's revelation settled upon the room like a physical presence, transforming the elegant chamber from a place of mourning into the scene of a calculated crime. Sir Reginald's composure, maintained through sheer force of will, finally cracked as the full implications became clear. His daughter had not simply died, she had been murdered with a precision that spoke of both scientific knowledge and theatrical malice. Holmes wasted no time in sentiment, immediately turning his attention to the practical matters of evidence collection. "Sir Reginald, I shall require the note that accompanied this infernal device, as well as any remnants of its packaging. Every detail, however trivial, may prove crucial to our investigation." The butler, Morton, was summoned with characteristic efficiency. A man of grave bearing and precise manner, he produced from Sir Reginald's locked writing desk a single envelope and card, both of which Holmes examined with his customary intensity. The card was of fine stock with a faint bluish cast, bearing no immediately visible watermark, though under his magnifying glass I observed him noting details invisible to the ordinary eye. "The hand is cultivated yet deliberately disguised," Holmes murmured, holding the paper at various angles to catch the light. "Note the studied regularity of the letters, the careful anonymity of the script, yet observe this slight burr in the pen nib that leaves minute spatters at the downstrokes. Such a defect is born of impatient pressure, suggesting our correspondent labored to conceal his natural writing style." He raised the paper to his nose with that peculiar delicacy I had learned to associate with his most significant discoveries. "Mastic," he announced with quiet satisfaction. "A painter's varnish, recently applied in a room where turpentine was used liberally. The combination is distinctive and speaks to recent proximity to an artist's studio." Lestrade, ever eager to seize upon concrete leads, immediately brightened. Penrith, the portrait painter, Miss Hartwell, mentioned his curious interest in the mirror's arrival. Holmes closed his notebook with characteristic precision. "Perhaps, Inspector. Or it might indicate any number of individuals who work with such materials or have recently visited an artist's establishment. We must test our theories, not merely assume their validity." Morton led us to the mews yard where the mirror's packing materials had been carefully preserved against the damp beneath a canvas tarpaulin. Holmes knelt among the straw and wooden fragments with the focused attention of a naturalist examining rare specimens. His long fingers sorted through the materials with surgical precision, pausing frequently to study particular items through his magnifying glass. "Observe, Watson, the binding cord bears traces of sea tar, a preservative used in certain riverside warehouses. This straw shows the distinctive nodal joints of Italian rye, commonly imported with glassware by dealers along the Strand and Holborn. Yet these wood shavings are not mere packing material, but the product of recent carpentry work, walnut freshly planed and bearing traces of shellac." Morton, prompted by Holmes's careful questioning, provided a detailed account of the mirror's delivery. 2 men had arrived near dusk, one bearing a distinctive scar along his jaw and walking with a peculiar catch in his step. They had presented a printed receipt from a reputable Strand dealer and insisted upon positioning the mirror themselves, claiming it required delicate handling. "Their hands, Morton," Holmes pressed with evident interest. "Describe them precisely." "Workman's hands, sir, heavily calloused with dark staining beneath the nails. There was a particular shine to the stains and a smell that reminded me of the card you examined, sir. Varnish, I believe." This detail seemed to energize Holmes considerably, and he immediately dispatched telegrams to the Strand dealer mentioned on the receipt and to one of his irregular network of street informants. The morning's investigation had yielded a wealth of physical evidence, yet I sensed that Holmes remained troubled by some aspect of the case that eluded my understanding. Our next destination was the modest Bloomsbury residence of Mr. Alastair Finch, the chemist, whose rejected courtship of Lady Catherine had made him the most obvious suspect in Lestrade's estimation. The fog had finally lifted, replaced by pale November sunlight that cast long shadows across the quiet residential street. Finch himself proved to be a man of slight build with receding fair hair and nervous mannerisms that became more pronounced upon recognizing Sir Reginald. His clothes, though of good quality, bore the telltale chemical odours of his profession, and his hands showed the silver nitrate staining common to photographic work. "Mr. Finch," Holmes began with characteristic directness, "we are investigating the death of Lady Catherine Ashworth. I understand you had formed an acquaintance with her in recent months. The man's pale complexion grew paler still, and a nervous twitch developed around his left eye. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I had hoped for a closer association, but Lady Catherine made her feelings quite clear. Perhaps I was too persistent in my attentions, but surely you cannot suspect me of any wrongdoing in connection with her death. Holmes explained the circumstances of Lady Catherine's passing without revealing the specific method, emphasizing only the mysterious nature of her demise. Finch listened with growing agitation, his hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the information. "Impossible," he breathed, running nervous fingers through his thinning hair. "A spontaneous cessation of life with no apparent cause. It defies every principle of medical science. Surely there must be some explanation, some overlooked symptom or condition." The method, we believe, involved a sophisticated chemical agent, Holmes stated, watching Finch's reaction carefully. "You, sir, possess the knowledge necessary to devise such a substance." Finch recoiled as if struck, his indignation evident. "Are you accusing me based solely on my profession and my admiration for Lady Catherine? I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I am a man of science, not a murderer. Yes, her rejection wounded me deeply, but I would never wish her harm, much less engineer her death." He proceeded to provide a detailed account of his activities on the morning in question, claiming to have been absorbed in developing a new photographic solution that required absolute concentration and precise timing. He even produced meticulously dated laboratory notes documenting each stage of his experiment, though the technical complexity served more to confuse than convince. As we departed Finch's residence, I found myself increasingly certain of his guilt, his agitation, his chemical expertise, his wounded pride over Lady Catherine's rejection. All seemed to point inexorably toward him as our perpetrator. Yet Holmes remained thoughtfully silent, his expression suggesting that some crucial element continued to elude his grasp. "The case appears quite clear, Holmes," I ventured as our cab made its way back toward Baker Street. "Finch possesses both the knowledge and the motive necessary for such a crime." Holmes turned to me with that particular expression I had learned to associate with cases that defied simple solutions. "Indeed, Watson, the evidence against Mr. Finch appears almost overwhelming, yet I cannot escape the feeling that we are being led down a path carefully prepared for us, following clues arranged with deliberate precision to point toward a predetermined conclusion." His words carried a weight of foreboding that seemed to settle over our investigation like the morning fog, suggesting that the truth behind Lady Catherine's death lay hidden beneath layers of deception far more complex than we had yet imagined. Holmes's foreboding proved well-founded, though in ways none of us could have anticipated. Upon our return to Baker Street, he immediately set about analyzing the samples recovered from the diabolical mirror, arranging his chemical apparatus with the methodical precision that marked his most serious investigations. The familiar blue flame of his spirit lamp cast dancing shadows across the sitting room as he began his systematic examination of the evidence. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, dissolving a minute trace of the mirror's residue in distilled water before adding several drops of a pale green solution. "The reaction will tell us much about our adversary's sophistication." A second reagent followed, then a careful measure of dilute acid that sent up a whisper of steam. Within moments, a ghostly colour began to bloom in the beaker, deepening from grey to an unmistakable Prussian blue. "Cyanide," I breathed, recognizing the classic test despite my limited chemical knowledge. "Indeed, Watson, prussic acid, though in a form far more sophisticated than the crude preparations typically encountered in criminal cases." Holmes next examined the opalescent liquid from the hidden chamber, warming a small quantity until it released its vaporous essence through a length of moistened paper. The result confirmed his suspicions with scientific certainty. "Hydrogen cyanide in a volatile carrier solution," he announced with grim satisfaction. The mechanism required no complex reaction at the moment of death. The poison was prepared beforehand, designed to vaporize when exposed to heat from gas lighting, sunlight, or even human proximity. Elegant in its simplicity, deadly in its precision. Mrs. Hudson's appearance with telegrams interrupted our analysis, bringing responses to Holmes's earlier inquiries. The first message confirmed our suspicions about the fraudulent receipt, while the second provided a tantalizing lead toward Drury Lane and the mysterious delivery men with their distinctive markings and chemical odors. "The evidence points increasingly toward the artistic community," Holmes observed, studying the accumulated clues with renewed interest. The mastic varnish, the Italian rye straw used in packing fine glassware, the walnut shavings bearing traces of recent carpentry work. Yet I find myself troubled by the very obviousness of Mr. Finch's apparent guilt. I expressed my conviction that the chemist remained our most likely suspect, but Holmes shook his head with characteristic skepticism. "Consider the theatrical nature of this crime, Watson, the elaborate mechanism, the choice of a mirror as the delivery system, the mysterious note from an admirer. This suggests a mind that delights in complexity, in the intellectual challenge of creating an apparently impossible mystery. Finch, for all his chemical knowledge, struck me as a man of precise, scientific temperament rather than baroque theatrical sensibilities." Holmes moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose of intense concentration. "No, Watson, I suspect we are being led down a carefully prepared path, following clues arranged with deliberate precision to point toward a predetermined conclusion. The very perfection of the case against Finch makes him less likely to be our true adversary." His words proved more prophetic than either of us could have imagined. Within the hour, a breathless constable arrived with news that transformed our entire understanding of the case. Mr. Alistair Finch had been found dead in his Bloomsbury laboratory, apparently the victim of accidental exposure to chemical vapors during his photographic work. "Accidental exposure," Holmes repeated, his grey eyes taking on that particular gleam I had learned to associate with moments of revelation. How remarkably convenient for someone who might have wished to eliminate a potential witness or accomplice. We immediately made our way to Finch's residence, where Lestrade met us with evident bewilderment. The scene bore disturbing similarities to Lady Catherine's death, the same peaceful expression suggesting life had simply departed without struggle or apparent cause. Yet Holmes's examination of the laboratory revealed crucial evidence that the local authorities had overlooked. "Note these particular compounds, Watson," he observed, indicating several bottles that seemed out of place among Finch's photographic supplies. Reagents used not in photography, but in the preparation of volatile organic substances. According to his laboratory notes, Finch was working exclusively on photographic emulsions, yet here we find traces of the same opalescent residue discovered in Lady Catherine's mirror. Among the ashes in the laboratory's small fireplace, Holmes discovered fragments of a partially burned letter bearing traces of the same distinctive paper used in the note that accompanied the fatal mirror. Though largely destroyed, the surviving portions revealed references to the commission as discussed and payment upon successful completion. "Our true adversary begins to emerge from the shadows," Holmes announced with quiet intensity. "Someone employed Finch to create the poison, then eliminated him to prevent any possibility of exposure. We are dealing with a mind of exceptional cunning, one that plans not merely the crime itself, but the systematic elimination of all evidence." The implications settled upon us like a shroud. 2 people were dead, killed by the same sophisticated method, yet the identity of their murderer remained frustratingly elusive. The evidence increasingly pointed towards someone within the artistic community, someone with access to specialized knowledge and the theatrical temperament to devise such an elaborate scheme. Mr. Penrith's name continues to intrude upon our investigation, Holmes observed as we prepared to leave Finch's laboratory. His foreknowledge of the mirror's arrival, his connection to the world of varnishes and artistic supplies, his recent portrait work with Lady Catherine. The time has come to examine more closely the activities of this accomplished painter. As our cab made its way through London's darkening streets toward Fitzroy Square, I could not shake the feeling that we were approaching the heart of a web of deception far more complex and dangerous than we had initially suspected. Holmes's words echoed in my mind with ominous certainty. We were now hunting a predator who had demonstrated both the ability and the inclination to kill without warning, eliminating obstacles with the same methodical precision that had characterized the original crime. The game, as Holmes would say, was truly afoot, and the stakes had risen considerably with each revelation. 2 victims lay dead, and somewhere in the fog-shrouded city, a murderer of exceptional cunning continued to move freely, confident in the elaborate deceptions that had thus far concealed his identity from even the most penetrating investigation. The elegant Georgian facades of Fitzroy Square stood bathed in the amber glow of gas lamps as our hansom drew to a halt before number 17. The November evening had settled over London with its characteristic chill, and wisps of fog were beginning to gather once more in the corners and alleyways, lending an air of mystery to our continued investigation. Holmes sat forward with that particular intensity I had learned to associate with cases approaching their crucial phase, his grey eyes reflecting the flickering light of the street lamps as he studied the artistic quarter that housed our next subject of inquiry. Mr. Jasper Penrith received us in his spacious studio with the polished urbanity of a man accustomed to receiving patrons and critics alike. A gentleman of perhaps 45 years, he possessed the lean build and intense gaze common to those who spent their lives observing the world with artistic precision. His dark hair was touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and his hands bore the telltale stains of his profession, though I noted they appeared recently scrubbed with unusual thoroughness. "Gentlemen, what an unexpected pleasure," Penrith declared, ushering us into a chamber dominated by easels and canvases in various stages of completion. The air was heavy with the distinctive odours of turpentine, linseed oil, and that particular mastic varnish Holmes had detected on the mysterious correspondence. I had heard whispers of some tragedy befalling dear Lady Catherine, though the details remain frustratingly vague among our artistic community. Holmes surveyed the studio with his characteristic thoroughness, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the artist's working environment. Brushes stood in neat rows according to size and type, pigments were arranged with scientific precision, and the entire space bore the hallmarks of a methodical mind that approached creativity with systematic discipline. "Mr. Penrith, we understand you were well acquainted with Lady Catherine Ashworth and had recently undertaken portrait work for her," Holmes began, his tone carefully neutral. "We are investigating the circumstances surrounding her death and would appreciate your assistance in clarifying certain matters." The artist's expression grew, genuinely sorrowful, and he gestured toward a covered canvas that dominated one corner of the studio. Indeed, I had been working on her portrait for several months. Such a vibrant subject, full of life and intelligence. To think that she has been taken from us seems almost inconceivable. With reverent care, Penrith drew back the cloth to reveal a portrait of exceptional quality. Lady Catherine's likeness gazed out from the canvas with startling vitality, her eyes seeming to follow the observer with that peculiar quality that marked the work of a truly gifted artist. Yet something in the painting's composition immediately caught Holmes's attention, and he moved closer with his magnifying glass to examine a particular detail. "Remarkable work," Holmes observed, studying the intricate rendering of what appeared to be an ornate mirror positioned behind the subject's left shoulder. "The treatment of this reflected surface shows extraordinary attention to detail. I assume you had opportunity to study the actual piece?" "Ah, you have a keen eye for artistic technique, Mr. Holmes," Penrith replied with evident pleasure. Lady Catherine had recently acquired an antique Venetian mirror of exceptional quality and specifically requested its incorporation into the composition. She was quite taken with its unique properties and felt it would add symbolic depth to the portrait. Holmes continued his examination, noting the precise rendering of the mirror's ornate silver frame. "Your familiarity with the piece appears quite intimate. Did you have occasion to examine it closely?" "Artistic necessity demands such attention to detail," Penrith explained with theatrical flourish. "Lady Catherine was kind enough to describe its construction in considerable detail during our sessions. The quality of both glass and frame was quite extraordinary, with craftsmanship rarely seen in contemporary pieces." As Holmes moved about the studio, I found myself drawn to a workbench where various bottles and containers held the tools of Penrith's trade. Among the familiar solvents and pigments, several substances seemed unusual for conventional artistic work, including traces of materials that reminded me uncomfortably of our recent chemical discoveries. "You maintain quite an extensive collection of specialized compounds," I observed, indicating the suspicious containers. Penrith glanced at the materials with apparent casualness, though I detected a slight stiffening in his manner. "The pursuit of artistic excellence requires constant experimentation with new techniques and formulations. I have been collaborating with various chemists on developing improved preservation methods for oil paintings." Holmes straightened abruptly, his grey eyes taking on that familiar intensity. "Chemists, you say? Would this collaboration have included Mr. Alastair Finch, by any chance?" For the briefest moment, Penrith's composed facade flickered, revealing something darker beneath the surface. "Mr. Finch approached me several months ago with proposals for chemical treatments that might enhance the longevity of painted works. Unfortunately, our association ended when he became obsessed with some personal matter involving unrequited affection." The pieces of the puzzle began arranging themselves in Holmes's mind with visible rapidity, and I could see the familiar gleam of understanding beginning to illuminate his features. We had found our connection between the victim, the chemist, and the theatrical mind capable of devising such an elaborate crime. "Mr. Penrith," Holmes announced with characteristic formality, "your assistance has been most illuminating. However, I must ask you to remain available for further questioning as our investigation proceeds. The death of Lady Catherine Ashworth was no natural occurrence, and we shall require complete cooperation from all who knew her." As we prepared to depart, Holmes made careful notes about the studio's contents and the various materials present among Penrith's supplies. The artist's connection to both victim and deceased chemist had transformed him from peripheral figure to central suspect, yet something in his manner suggested layers of deception that would require considerable skill to unravel completely. The weight of Holmes's foreboding proved well-founded as we departed Penrith's studio into the thickening November mist. His contemplative silence during our cab ride back to Baker Street spoke volumes about the complexity of the web we were attempting to unravel. Only when we had reached the familiar sanctuary of our sitting room did he finally speak his voice carrying that particular intensity I had learned to associate with cases approaching their crucial phase. "Watson, we stand at the threshold of revelation, yet I sense that the truth lies buried beneath layers of deception far more intricate than we have yet penetrated." Holmes moved immediately to his chemical apparatus, where the samples from our investigation awaited further analysis. While the evidence against Penrith appears compelling, something in his manner suggests we have not yet grasped the full scope of his criminal enterprise. Mrs. Hudson's timely arrival with the evening post brought an unexpected development that would transform our understanding entirely. Among the correspondence lay a hastily written note from Sir Reginald requesting our immediate return to Belgravia on a matter of the utmost urgency. The message, penned in obvious distress, mentioned the discovery of additional papers among Lady Catherine's effects that shed new light upon her final days. We found Sir Reginald in his study, his distinguished features bearing the strain of fresh revelations. Before him on the mahogany desk lay a leather portfolio, its contents arranged with careful precision. "Mr. Holmes, while organizing Catherine's personal papers for the solicitors, I discovered this hidden within a false bottom of her writing desk. The implications are most disturbing." The portfolio contained a remarkable collection of documents that revealed Lady Catherine to have been conducting a private investigation of considerable sophistication. Detailed notes in her elegant hand documented discrepancies in the provenance of several valuable paintings that had recently appeared in London's art market. Photographs of brushwork, chemical analyses of pigments, and correspondence with continental experts painted a picture of systematic art forgery on a grand scale. "Your daughter had uncovered a criminal enterprise of remarkable audacity," Holmes observed, studying the meticulous documentation with evident admiration. "These paintings, supposedly Renaissance masterworks, show clear evidence of modern materials and techniques. The forger possessed exceptional skill, yet Lady Catherine's trained eye detected the deception." Among the papers lay a draft letter that made Sir Reginald's hands tremble as he passed it to Holmes. In Lady Catherine's careful script, it outlined her intention to confront the individual responsible for these forgeries, offering him the opportunity to confess privately before she felt compelled to expose the matter publicly. The letter was addressed to Mr. Jasper Penrith and dated the very morning of her death. She arranged to meet with him in her dressing-room, Sir Reginald whispered, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. Catherine believed she was offering mercy to someone she had trusted, but instead she was walking into a carefully prepared trap. Holmes examined the draft with his magnifying glass, noting the careful consideration evident in every phrase. Lady Catherine possessed both courage and compassion, qualities that ultimately proved fatal when dealing with a mind capable of such calculated evil. The final document in the portfolio provided the missing piece that completed our understanding of the crime's true nature. A receipt from a Tottenham Court Road cabinet maker, dated 3 days before the mirror's delivery, detailed the construction of a specialized mounting with precise specifications for concealed compartments and carefully positioned apertures. The measurements matched exactly those we had observed in the fatal mirror's frame. "Penrith commissioned the mirror's preparation well in advance," Holmes announced with grim satisfaction. "This was no crime of passion, but a calculated execution, planned with the methodical precision of a theatrical production. He used his artistic knowledge to create not merely a delivery system for poison, but a psychological trap that would ensure his victim positioned herself precisely where the vapors would prove most lethal." The implications of this discovery settled upon the room like a shroud. Lady Catherine had died not as the random victim of an impossible crime, but as the deliberate target of a murderer who had transformed her compassionate nature into the instrument of her own destruction. Holmes rose abruptly, his grey eyes taking on that familiar gleam of intellectual pursuit reaching its climax. "Sir Reginald, I shall require your cooperation in setting a trap of our own." Mr. Penrith's artistic vanity and confidence in his elaborate deception will prove to be his ultimate downfall. Tomorrow we shall arrange a confrontation that will force him to reveal the full extent of his criminal enterprise. The game had indeed become afoot in earnest, and somewhere in the fog-shrouded city, a murderer of exceptional cunning awaited the inevitable reckoning that would determine whether justice or deception would ultimately triumph. Holmes's elaborate trap began to unfold with the methodical precision that marked his most significant cases. The previous evening had been spent in careful preparation, transforming Lady Catherine's dressing room into a stage where justice would finally be served. Working with the concentrated focus of a master craftsman, Holmes had carefully drained the remaining volatile poison from the mirror's hidden mechanism and flushed the hair-thin channels with a neutralizing solution of his own devising. In its place, he introduced a harmless but revealing substitute, a weak solution of ammonia tinted with aniline dye, so faint as to be nearly invisible until exposed to air and human contact. The morning brought a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to appeal to Penrith's artistic vanity and his confidence in his own intellectual superiority. Sir Reginald, demonstrating remarkable composure despite his grief, dispatched a message under his own seal requesting the artist's immediate presence. The pretext was delicate yet irresistible, concerning the disposition of Lady Catherine's unfinished portrait and certain matters of artistic authenticity that required expert consultation. Lestrade positioned his men with admirable discretion, one concealed behind the heavy draperies of the adjacent morning room, another stationed where he could observe the proceedings through a carefully adjusted panel. Mary Hartwell, though visibly strained by returning to that haunted chamber, was given precise instructions for her role in the unfolding drama. Holmes himself had chosen a position near the fireplace where shadow and light would serve his purposes perfectly. At precisely 7:30, the sound of wheels on gravel announced Penrith's arrival. He entered the dressing-room with his characteristic urbanity intact, though I detected a subtle tension in his manner as his eyes immediately sought the ornate Venetian mirror. The glass stood exactly as Holmes had positioned it, angled to invite examination while catching the gaslight in complex patterns that seemed almost to move of their own accord. "Mr. Penrith," Sir Reginald began with admirable steadiness, "your presence is required to clarify certain matters that have come to light regarding my daughter's final days. Documents discovered among her personal effects suggest she had uncovered irregularities in the art market that troubled her greatly." Holmes stepped forward from the shadows, producing Lady Catherine's leather portfolio with dramatic precision. "Indeed, Mr. Penrith, your late patron appears to have been conducting a most thorough investigation into systematic art forgery. Her notes, detailed discrepancies in brushwork, chemical analyses of pigments, and correspondence with continental experts, most illuminating reading." The transformation in Penrith's demeanour was immediate and revealing. The polished confidence that had marked our previous encounters gave way to something far more calculating and dangerous. His dark eyes took on the cold intelligence of a predator suddenly aware that his carefully constructed deceptions were under scrutiny. Lady Catherine possessed an unfortunate tendency toward meddling in matters beyond her comprehension, Penrith replied, his voice carrying a new quality that made the elegant chamber seem to darken around us. Such curiosity can prove remarkably dangerous when it extends into areas where discretion would be more appropriate. Holmes moved closer to the mirror, his keen eyes fixed upon the ornate silver frame. "Dangerous enough to warrant murder, Mr. Penrith, for that is precisely what occurred in this very room." Lady Catherine arranged to meet with you here, offering you the opportunity to confess privately before she felt compelled to expose your criminal enterprise publicly. You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes, Penrith said. Yet his gaze was drawn inexorably to the mirror that had served as his instrument of death. Lady Catherine died of natural causes. Even the physician could find no evidence of foul play. Observe this remarkable piece more closely, Holmes suggested, with deceptive casualness. The craftsmanship is indeed exceptional, particularly these intricate silver scrollwork details near the base. Such artistry deserves careful examination. Almost despite himself, Penrith approached the mirror with the proprietary air of a connoisseur. His artist's eye was drawn to the very mechanism he had helped design, and his fingers moved with practiced familiarity toward the concealed catch that governed the deadly apparatus. The moment his skin made contact with the treated surface, a whisper of vapor escaped the frame, and within seconds a pale violet bloom began to appear along the whorls of his fingertips. "Most illuminating," Holmes observed with quiet satisfaction. "The chemical reaction is quite distinctive, Mr. Penrith. Inspector Lestrade, if you would be so good as to compare the residue now marking our guest's hands with the samples we recovered from this very mirror." The artist's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely, revealing the cold intelligence that had conceived and executed Lady Catherine's murder. Yet rather than panic or denial, Penrith displayed only a calculating interest in Holmes's accusations, as if he were observing a particularly clever theatrical performance. The mirror was indeed a masterpiece of both artistic and scientific achievement, he admitted with chilling matter-of-factness. Lady Catherine positioned herself exactly as I had anticipated, drawn by feminine vanity to examine her reflection in that remarkable glass. The mechanism functioned with perfect precision. And poor Finch, Holmes pressed, his grey eyes blazing with controlled fury at the callous dismissal of innocent life. Alistair served his purpose admirably, though his nervous temperament made him unsuitable for long-term collaboration. His elimination was simply prudent business practice, ensuring no inconvenient testimonies could emerge at inopportune moments. The casual admission of double murder hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the elegant dressing room into something approaching a chamber of horrors. Sir Reginald's face had gone ashen with grief and rage, while Lestrade stepped forward with his constables to effect the arrest. "Mr. Jasper Penrith," the inspector announced with grim satisfaction, "I arrest you for the murders of Lady Catherine Ashworth and Mr. Alistair Finch. You will accompany us to Scotland Yard, where you will face the full weight of British justice." As the constables secured the prisoner, Penrith turned to Holmes with something approaching professional admiration. "You have staged quite an elaborate performance yourself, Mr. Holmes. The creation of perfect crimes requires the same aesthetic sensibility as the creation of perfect art. Both demand vision, technical skill, and the courage to pursue beauty, regardless of conventional moral constraints." Holmes regarded the murderer with cold disdain. "The difference, Mr. Penrith, is that true art celebrates life, while your perverted creativity has served only death. There is no beauty in the calculated destruction of innocence, only the ugliness of a mind that has confused cleverness with wisdom." As we watched the prisoner led away through the gaslit corridors of the Ashworth residence, I could not help but reflect upon the terrible price of unchecked vanity and the deadly consequences when artistic temperament is wedded to criminal intent. The case of the mirror that waited with death was finally closed, yet the memory of Lady Catherine's courage and the evil that had destroyed her would linger long in the shadows of that elegant chamber. The silence that settled upon Lady Catherine's dressing-room after Penrith's departure carried the weight of revelation, as if the very air had been cleansed of the malevolent presence that had conceived such calculated evil. Holmes remained beside the dismantled mirror, his keen eyes making one final survey of the mechanism that had served as both artistic inspiration and instrument of death. Sir Reginald stood in the doorway, his distinguished features bearing the complex expression of a man who had witnessed justice triumph over the most sophisticated deception. The solution, gentlemen, lay not in supernatural explanation, but in the methodical analysis of physical evidence. Holmes began, his voice carrying that particular intensity I had learned to associate with his most satisfying intellectual victories. From the moment we discovered the peculiar film upon the mirror's surface, coupled with the distinctive chemical odor, we were dealing with a volatile compound designed to vaporize under specific conditions. He moved to the ornate silver frame, indicating the nearly invisible perforations that had served such deadly purpose. The Prussian blue reaction confirmed hydrogen cyanide, while the opalescent liquid from the hidden chamber revealed a sophisticated delivery system. The positioning of these apertures, precisely where a seated person would naturally place their face when examining their reflection, demonstrated the calculated nature of the crime. Holmes withdrew his notebook, consulting the meticulous observations that had guided our investigation. The packing materials provided the next crucial thread: Italian rye straw used specifically for transporting delicate glassware from continental dealers, sea tar upon the binding cord, indicating riverside warehouses, most significantly fresh walnut shavings bearing traces of shellac, suggesting recent carpentry work rather than mere protective packing. The Tottenham Court Road invoice completed this particular chain of evidence, he continued, producing the document from his coat. A specialized mounting commissioned with precise specifications for concealed compartments and positioned apertures. The measurements matched exactly those we observed in the mirror's frame. Lestrade, who had returned with additional constables, now provided the final pieces of our puzzle. The search of Penrith's studio has revealed an extensive forgery operation, Mr. Holmes. Records indicate systematic fraud extending back at least 5 years, with clients across Europe. The financial scope is staggering, involving dozens of supposedly Renaissance masterworks commanding thousands of pounds. Holmes nodded with grim satisfaction. Lady Catherine's investigation threatened to expose this entire criminal enterprise. Her meticulous documentation of discrepancies in brushwork and chemical analysis of pigments would have destroyed Penrith's carefully constructed reputation and lucrative business. Her elimination became not merely convenient but absolutely essential to his continued operations. "And poor Finch?" I inquired, though I suspected the answer. "Manipulated from the beginning," Holmes replied, his voice heavy with contempt for such calculated exploitation. Approached under the pretense of developing preservation techniques for oil paintings, his scientific expertise was perverted to create the volatile compound that would serve as Lady Catherine's executioner. Once the poison was delivered, Finch became a dangerous liability whose growing suspicions made his own murder inevitable. Sir Reginald approached the mirror with evident reluctance, his grief-stricken features reflecting profound violation at learning how his daughter's trust had been exploited. To think that Catherine welcomed this monster into our home, confided her discoveries to him in the belief that he possessed some measure of honor. Your daughter's courage in pursuing her investigation, even when it led her into mortal danger, deserves to be remembered alongside the tragedy of her death, Holmes observed with uncharacteristic gentleness. She died in service to truth and justice, qualities that ultimately ensured her murderer's downfall. As we prepared to depart the Ashworth residence, Holmes paused at the threshold of Lady Catherine's chamber, his grey eyes taking in the elegant appointments that had witnessed such calculated evil. The room would be sealed now against painful memories, yet Somehow, I sensed that justice had brought a measure of peace to the young woman's spirit. The case demonstrates once again that no crime, however ingeniously conceived, can ultimately withstand methodical investigation, Holmes observed as our cab made its way through London's darkening streets. Penrith's very cleverness became his undoing, for complexity inevitably leaves traces that the trained mind can detect and interpret. The fog was lifting as we returned to Baker Street, revealing stars that seemed to shine with unusual brilliance in the November sky. Behind us lay a case that had tested every aspect of Holmes's remarkable abilities, proving once more that reason remains the one mirror which flatters no man, reflecting only truth in all its stark and uncompromising clarity. The familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room provided a welcome sanctuary after the grim revelations we had witnessed in Belgravia. Holmes settled into his accustomed chair with evident satisfaction, reaching for his violin with the deliberate movements of a man who had successfully concluded a particularly challenging intellectual exercise. The fire crackled warmly in the grate, casting dancing shadows that seemed to banish the lingering darkness of our recent investigation. "The case of the death that waited in the mirror," Holmes mused, drawing his bow across the strings with pensive precision, "demonstrates the fundamental principle that governs all criminal investigation. No matter how elaborate the deception, how sophisticated the mechanism, or how theatrical the presentation, truth possesses an inherent clarity that ultimately reveals itself to the methodical observer." I poured myself a brandy, still shaken by the calculated cruelty we had uncovered. The mournful notes of Holmes's violin filled the room, a fitting elegy for Lady Catherine and a subtle commentary on the dark recesses of the human spirit. Penrith's confession was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire affair, his casual dismissal of two human lives as mere obstacles to his artistic and financial ambitions. Indeed, Watson, we witnessed the corruption of genuine talent by unchecked vanity and greed. Holmes lowered his instrument, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. Penrith possessed considerable skill as both artist and chemist, yet chose to employ these gifts in service of deception and murder rather than legitimate achievement. His downfall lay in the very theatrical nature of his crimes, the elaborate mirror mechanism, the mysterious note from an admirer, the carefully staged impossibility of Lady Catherine's death, all revealed a mind that could not resist demonstrating its cleverness. Mrs. Hudson appeared with the evening papers and correspondence, their headlines already proclaiming the arrest of the notorious art forger and double murderer. Sir Reginald called earlier with news of the trial preparations, she informed us with evident satisfaction. "The evidence you gathered appears quite overwhelming. The prosecution expects a swift conviction." Holmes nodded with quiet approval. "Justice will be served, though it cannot restore the lives so callously taken. Lady Catherine's courage in pursuing her investigation, even unto death, has at least ensured that her murderer will face the consequences of his actions." The weeks that followed brought the inevitable conclusion to our involvement in the affair. Penrith's trial proceeded with methodical efficiency, the physical evidence we had gathered proving irrefutable despite his counsel's attempts to suggest alternative explanations. The jury required less than an hour to reach their verdict, and the judge's sentence reflected society's revulsion at crimes so calculated and cold-blooded. Sir Reginald, though still deeply grieving, found a measure of solace in the swift administration of justice. The discovery of his daughter's courage and dedication to uncovering the truth became a source of profound pride, tempering the unbearable sorrow of her loss. His subsequent efforts to establish a foundation in Lady Catherine's memory, dedicated to the ethical preservation and authentication of artistic works, served as a lasting tribute to her investigative spirit. On a crisp December morning, Holmes received word that justice had taken its final course. Penrith had maintained his arrogant composure to the end, apparently regarding his execution as merely the final act in an elaborate theatrical performance. His last words, according to the prison chaplain, were a request that his unfinished paintings be preserved for posterity, demonstrating that vanity remained his governing passion, even in the shadow of the gallows. "The greatest tragedy," Holmes observed, carefully placing his violin back in its case, "lies not in the act itself, but in the perversion of intellect. Penrith possessed a brilliant mind capable of creating works of genuine beauty, yet he chose to dedicate that talent to deceit and destruction. The mirror that he designed to reflect only deception has been replaced by the clear glass of truth." I found myself reflecting upon the broader implications of our investigation, the way in which Lady Catherine's meticulous documentation would serve authorities for years to come, ensuring that other victims of Penrith's elaborate deceptions might finally receive justice. Her legacy extended far beyond her tragic death, exposing systematic fraud that might otherwise have remained hidden indefinitely. Holmes moved to the window, peering out into the street where the December fog had lifted, revealing stars that shone with unusual brilliance in the clear night sky. "The world, my dear Watson, is full of such mirrors. Some reflect beauty, some reflect truth, and some, like the one in Lady Catherine's chamber, are designed to reflect nothing but deception and death. Our task, as always, is to discern which is which." He turned from the window, that familiar spark of intellectual curiosity already returning to his keen grey eyes. "I believe Mrs. Hudson mentioned a rather peculiar incident involving a missing emerald and a distressed opera singer this morning, perhaps a fresh puzzle to cleanse the palate after such a heavy meal of human villainy." And with that characteristic restlessness, the great detective turned his formidable mind from the grim reflections of the past to the fresh mysteries that awaited, leaving me to ponder the intricate dance between brilliance and depravity, and the enduring power of methodical observation to illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart. The case of the death that waited in the mirror had ended, but justice, like truth itself, possessed a clarity that no amount of deception could ultimately obscure.